start of this month, we've seen unprecedented levels of bloodshed and extreme violence in Sudan. Sudan's Rapid Support Forces militia seized the city of El Fasher in Darfur, and within 48 hours, they killed over 2,000 civilians, committed systematic attacks on health facilities, health workers, patients, and humanitarian aid workers. And the mass killings were so brutal and on such a scale that bloodstains on the ground could be seen on satellite imagery of El Fasher. And according to the UN, around 177,000 civilians are still trapped in Al Fasher by a 56-kilometer blockage built by the RSF, which is sealing off food, medicine, and escape routes. Since April 2023, it's estimated that around 150,000 Sudanese civilians have been killed, and by July this year, 12 million people have been displaced and pushed into famine. The levels of brutality and violence that the Sudanese people have previously and continue to experience are horrific, and a complete failure of the systems in place and the supposed role that the state has to play in protecting its people. It's important to look at how things have gotten to this point in Sudan. I wanted to share the story and lessons of the Sudanese revolution that happened in 2019 to contextualize this violence that we're seeing now as a retaliation of Sudan's ruling class against the Sudanese people for resisting, and most importantly, what this means now for us in the global north to support their struggle and for ordinary Sudanese people to continue to resist and to win. So just some background, Sudan is no stranger to crisis. This is rooted in the scars of colonization and exploitation that followed on from its independence in 1956. The British Empire divided regions and ethnicities to control and continue to access Sudan's resources. Sudan is an extremely rich country in resources and wealth. It is a country that's rich in oil and gold, both of which are dependent on the exploitations of a majority of ordinary Sudanese people to generate wealth for the elite few on top. Resistance to this exploitation and subjugation is also rife in Sudan. Prior to the 2019 revolution, there have also been two other uprisings. The struggle in Sudan's capital city, Khartoum, against the government led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011, which happened in the context of other revolts of the Arab Spring, notably in Tunisia and Egypt, that were able to topple their dictators' regimes. The independence of South Sudan had crippling economic effects, where the South took 3/4 of the country's oil, and economic crisis accelerated, and the government responded with austerity measures, removing subsidies on basic goods such as bread and fuel. And at the same time, the military spending in 2018 had reached 3 times more than the education and health budget combined. So in December 2018, that's where protests against the prices of bread and basic goods started. There's the story of a university student who was outraged by the price of falafel sandwiches that had gone up and led to student protests that spread across the city. Bigger protests broke out in Atbara, north of Khartoum, which was a historic center for labor activism in Sudan and where the central depot for Sudan Railways and the headquarters of the Railway Workers Union was. Protesters burned down al-Bashir's National Congress Party building, which started the trend nationally of protests burning down these party headquarters across the country. And within days, demonstrations were happening everywhere across Sudan. The Sudanese Professionals Association, the SPA, were central to developing this revolt. This was a group that consisted of teachers, doctors, engineers, pharmacists, and journalists who were calling for workplace actions and coordinating marches across the country. The SPA rallied thousands to march to the presidential palace in Khartoum to deliver a petition calling for al-Bashir, the dictator, to resign. This march was met with tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition from the military that stopped protesters from getting anywhere close to the building. However, the revolts carried through into 2019 with daily protests taking place in Khartoum, many led by women and students. Al-Bashir was scrambling. He was trying to crush the protests with repression and combining this with partial concessions, like canceling his plans to remove bread subsidies. But the movement had now evolved into demanding more than just reducing the prices of basic goods. And on the 6th of April, protesters marched to the military headquarters in Khartoum, where fragmented protests had now become a unified show of mass resistance, and they drew inspiration from Algeria and Egypt that were able to force their dictators out. Protesters surrounded the headquarters, they set up barricades, organized food, water, and security, and the sit-in became a city within a city, a non-stop celebration of a vision to transform Sudan. This eventually forced the dictator al-Bashir out of government. Military generals announced that al-Bashir had been removed, but that they would be taking control of the country for a transitional period. The military wanted to maintain the structure of the old regime, but protesters returned to the streets immediately, demanding the military council step aside. The SPA called for a general strike, with strike committees being set up in some areas to coordinate actions, and it led to debates over whether committees could challenge power and eliminate the need for military in government. On the 3rd of June, the RSF and military council forces decided to storm the Khartoum sit-in to try to weaken the morale of the protesters. Protesters were beat and killed. There were horrific reports of sexual violence and women being targeted, presumably for their forefront role in protests and challenging their challenge to the men in uniform. And over 200 people that day were killed. Their bodies were thrown into the Nile River. Tents were set on fire. And the military generals were clearly scrambling. They had shut down the internet and tried to halt the spread of information about what had happened. This also blocked the main tool of the SPA's organizing through social media, with the internet blockade lasting a month. And it was clear that while the movement had perfected the strategy of nonviolent revolt, of taking up space and being able to challenge the government, being able to kick out al-Bashir, this massacre was a direct challenge and raised the stakes, giving protesters a choice whether to submit or to escalate. It's clear that this decision to escalate and seize the old forms of government was not taken up, as civilians actually entered into a transitional government with the military. And this eventually led to a coup in 2021, where both military groups, the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the RSF, collaborated to put civilian members of the transitional government into prison and take over the state for themselves. And I think it's important to spell out the role that the army plays in upholding the oppressive state that exploits and represses the Sudanese people. While Sudan was able to bring down their dictator al-Bashir, the underlying regime still remained intact, including the armed forces that exist to protect that regime. The police and the army, the core of the state apparatus, remained unchanged and in power, and as a result, the military have carried out brutal massacres against protesters, and showing their key role in actually preventing revolutionary movements from winning deeper change, and keeping ordinary people from seizing power for themselves. The interests of the RSF and SAF lie with protecting the old regime that allows them to hoard wealth and profit for themselves, which would not be able to occur under civilian rule. The RSF profits from gold smuggling and hiring out mercenaries to the Gulf states to fight in wars in Yemen and Libya. SAF enriches itself through state assets and deals with imperialist allies, and this competition between the two groups is now playing out, where they're fighting for control over military and food resources of the state, like gold and livestock from Darfur, and ultimately for control over the Sudanese people themselves. Prior to the 2019 revolution, al-Bashir was reliant on various competing military groups to counteract each other so that no one group could stage a coup against him. However, his militia policy locked the Sudanese state into hiring more and more armed men, which contributed to his eventual demise. It was cash that was needed to incite these men to fight and stifle rebellion, but also cash that was needed to tame them from going after the government next. And this counterinsurgency strategy on the cheap turned out to be unsustainably expensive. And I think, we have to be absolutely clear that neither military group is interested in liberating the Sudanese people, improving their material conditions, or giving back any wealth to them. It was the two groups, SAF and the RSF, that conspired against civilians to crush the revolution and to commit massacres against these people. And they are committed to hoarding as much of the state power and resources and wealth that comes with it. So now what we are seeing, the current conflict in Sudan, is a counter-revolutionary war. It's backed by imperialists and regional powers to crush the Sudanese people's struggle for liberation and self-governance. I think it's worth noting that this conflict is intensified by the involvement of regional powers like Egypt and the UAE, who are backing the opposing sides. Egypt has maintained its relationship with SAF as a potential ally in disputes with Ethiopia over the Nile, while the UAE and Saudi Arabia have relied on Sudanese troops recruited by the RSF to fight against the Houthis. They also fear revolution from spreading across the region, from spreading from the Sudanese struggle and inspiring revolt in their own countries, and that could have the power to topple their own regimes. And there's also the intervention of states in the global north. Britain and the EU facilitated in the RSF's creation through the Khartoum process, which provided training to Sudanese security and border forces to control illegal migration from Sudan into Europe. And during the 2019 revolution, it was the US, the EU, and the African Union who pressured civilian opposition forces to share the government with the military. Western powers did not necessarily like the optics of the June massacre that the military committed in Khartoum, but decided that it was necessary if it could actually halt the revolution of the people. And lastly, the UN has a place in this too. The UN General Secretary called on the Sudanese people to be realistic and to accept the military in power after they couped it in 2021. So with that being said, I think it's worth highlighting the resistance to the regime in 2019, but what continues today in Sudan. People have turned their homes and shops into healthcare centers for people that need help. They are operating healthcare facilities and providing an alternative, people-centered and people-led alternative to the services of the state that are failing these people. The resistance committees that were set up in 2019 during the revolution, they oversaw a supply of flour to bakeries, to the distribution of bread and cooking gas. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some of the resistance committees sent out teams of activists to spread public health messages, to distribute masks. There are some cases where resistance committees have implanted themselves into the democratic mass movement. They elected general assemblies and executive committees, delegates that represented their neighborhood on local coordination and real, democratic control of these neighborhoods. And they pose a huge threat to the military and its regional imperialist backers because they show what unity and governance from below could actually look like in Sudan. They provide this stark contrast between the life-sustaining work of the people's democratic institutions compared to the trail of destruction left by the remaining Sudanese state institutions. And one Sudanese activist says that the Sudanese revolution tells us that people have amazing innovations and capabilities to find solutions for immediate problems. The state has failed us, but this is our chance to build something different. And I think for this resistance to continue and to pose a greater challenge to the regime, these resistance committees have to expand beyond just being organized on a geographical neighborhood basis. These geographical neighborhoods, they can be divided by their class interests. If you have some neighborhoods that represent, lower classes versus middle classes, that has an impact on actually the politics that they're bringing to the movement as well. Some may advocate for working with the military, while others demand for more radical change. And this kind of organization actually needs to expand into workplaces where the power to run that's where the power to run the entire country comes from. The people who can make decisions on what needs to be produced, how much, and how everyone's needs to be met comes from the workplaces and the workers that know how to run the entire country. And I think this also highlights the need for a revolutionary party as well. There was a Sudanese activist that said that they lacked a socialist voice, that said we shouldn't go for accepting a compromise with the military when the movement was at its peak. And unfortunately, they prioritized protecting the transitional government from 2019 to 2021 over the revolution. So we need, Sudan needs an organization that can frame an analysis of the situation, which can't simply be done by the existing grassroots bodies and resistance committees. That there needs to be a party that engages in debates over the military and the idea of what a Sudanese national identity looks like. There needs to be a simultaneous process of unification and separation, unifying all the oppressed and exploited masses and the separation from the ruling class in Sudan. But there also needs to be an examination, I guess, of the nature of Sudanese nationalism, which was revived by the upper classes after the revolution to obscure class interests and where, the people's power actually lies. So I think the task is there needs to be a rebuilding of a revolutionary movement. There needs to be international solidarity as well with the resistance committees, the unions, the grassroots organizations that embody the spirit of the revolution and the people's power in Sudan. The Sudanese people, they need international solidarity and movements that can stop the supply of arms in Sudan. But there also needs to be, exposing the UN for its role in the current crisis in Sudan, to expose, our government's agenda in putting imperial interests, militarization, and profit over people, exposing the involvement of the West in, supporting the military and supporting the constant brutality that the Sudanese people are experiencing, and to actually look to the hope and resistance that still lies in Sudan.